Africa and you teach Africans, you come away realising how important primary education is. We take primary education for granted here. Basic composition work, basic answering of questions, and yet a lot of these pastors basically have little primary education. They don't know how to read a text. So it may well, but the great problem, and therefore education frees us from enslavement to the text, to the commentary. But I still want to affirm the truth of the theological truth that the Bible is basically clear, because I've known undereducated people who come out with great clarity in their understanding of the gospel who would never read a commentary. That's all I want to affirm. Okay, and I think therefore that I want to affirm that in the light of our people who have never trained, because most of our people haven't trained, have done secondary school. And so they ought to be able to sit down and look at that. And therefore, it may be helpful to, when I give the text to an untrained person, just say, bear in mind, this is a shame culture. That's all they have to know. I'm not saying you don't read the commentary. I'm saying you read it later. See, if you look at that book by Don Carson, For the Love of God, he gives you McShane's 4 passages. Then he gives you a commentary on McShane's 4 passages. And he says, if you've only got time to read one thing, read one of the 4 passages. But I guarantee you that if anybody's like me, they read Don Carson's commentary and they don't read the passage, right? The Scripture Union method. Pray, read, think, pray. Yeah, I think that's it. Anyway, so the one I miss is the one that says think. I pray, I read the text of the Bible. I don't think, I read the Scripture Union comment. See, and we don't read the passage. So I think in Sydney, at our college anyway, our students are expert in how to read commentaries. But I want them, and you'll say to people, have you read and reread the text? I've read the commentary. The text, the commentary is not the text. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Take another example. Preach through the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation. There's a surface level of application, which is pretty obvious. You repent, do the deed, do the first. There's a huge wealth of background information which is targeted particularly at those particular churches and their location.
That's right.
Which an African pastor will never know unless, as
Yeah.
we're doing,
Yeah.
taking 30 books, which is the 30
Yeah.
only books he's got part of the Bible.
Yeah.
Does
Yeah.
he need that?
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? Anything else? Right. All right. Now, there are 2 areas I think that pastors need most help in, and that is the area of illustration and the area of application. Now, if you look at what is below the line here, it is the area of application. Haddon Robinson says, if heresy is to be preached, it will most often be preached in application. Now, this is where you'll get into trouble. Now, what I put it to you is this, that when it comes to application, the things I find most helpful to do are these. Number 1, the 2 unchanging elements from the text to now is God and people, God and us. What does the text therefore tell me about God? And what does the text tell me about people? And I just write down there what the text tells me about God and what the text tells me about people. Then, let's just look at that. Let's look at Acts 8, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. All right, what does it tell me about God? Okay, Acts 8, 26 to 40, all right? Okay, it tells me that God, or the angel of the Lord, sets up people to intercept with other people. That God is specific in his direction, go to the chariot and stay near it. That God's word can have a powerful influence. The man is reading Isaiah the prophet. Philip is by the chariot, and Philip, the messenger, is applying the word of God and preaching the gospel, and the gospel is powerful, God's gospel is powerful, so that this man is converted. So it teaches me that God has a heart for the lost, he directs the messenger to the lost, and he uses the gospel to save people, all right? Now that's what it teaches me about God. What does it teach me about people? It teaches me that people can be seekers, that people, that Christian people can be sensitive to God's direction, that Christian people need to be biblically, theologically sound. That is, they need to be able to get from Isaiah 53 to Jesus. So they need to be able to give an account of the hope that is within them. And it tells me that people under the influence of the gospel can come to salvation, or it teaches me all those things. Now then, what is the necessary application, what is the impossible application, and what is the possible application of the passage? Now this is the order I do these in. How must it apply to everyone? How must it not apply to everyone? That's the impossible application. And how may it apply to people? Now it's the possible area of application which will get you into trouble. All right? Now just let me give you an example of that. Flip back to Luke 16, because this is in my mind because I preached on it weekend before last. Let's look at Luke 16. This is an incredible parable of the shrewd manager. Luke 16, 1 to 8. The shrewd manager is going to be sacked. He decides that he's not strong enough to dig, he's too proud to beg, so he'll act in such a way as to earn favour from his master's debtors. He will cheat his master. How much do you owe my master? Verse 6, 800 gallons of olive oil, sit down and pay 400. 1,000 bushels of wheat, sit down and pay 800. The master, verse 8, commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Now what is incredible about that is the number of people who read that. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted dishonestly. It's not what it says. What is being commended here is shrewdness. So the man who gets ripped off commends the bloke who ripped him off. That's a surprise in itself, because that was very shrewd. For, look at what Jesus says, the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. In other words, business people are shrewder than people of the light. Lord Alan Sugar's on Apprentice, I know nothing about him, but he's the man who says you're sacked. I don't know how he got his wealth, but there must be some degree of shrewdness in Lord Alan Sugar's. And Jesus says, learn from Lord Alan Sugar's, because he's shrewd. Now, just as he's got his eye on the end of the financial year, the 30th of June, so you have your eye, verse 9, on when you will enter into your eternal dwellings. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. All right, now I've got to apply this. And application's going to get me into trouble, because application in two areas will always get you into trouble. One, wealth, and two, sex. Now, I don't know if Scottish preachers preach about sex, but you ought to be preaching about sex, because there's a lot of sex displayed out there in your advertisement, and your young people and old people are being constantly confronted by it. One of our elders at our church one time, we were talking about next year's preaching program, and I said we should have 3 weeks where we preach on sex. He said, oh, Chinese people don't like to speak about sex. No, but there are a lot of Chinese people. Now, that's the reality. There is a population of people in Scotland, and God invented it. And I'm not saying that in any way you be crude. I think that's appalling. Whenever I preach on sex, I imagine my mother is there, and I want her to get the DVD. She knows exactly what I'm talking about. She wants her great-grandchildren to hear this. If I can preach so that my mother is not embarrassed, then I think I've reached the target. Now, here is wealth. What is the necessary application of verse 9? Use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Shrewdly use your wealth with a view to the day when you enter into eternity. That's it. This man made shrewd use of his opportunity with his eye on the day in which he was going to be sacked. You make shrewd use of your wealth with an eye on the day when you're going to enter into your eternal dwellings. Now make shrewd use of your wealth. All right, that's fine. I'm happy with that. You haven't got under my skin at all with the necessary application. He's the unheeded Christ. Yeah. What is the impossible application? The impossible application is don't make shrewd use of your wealth with a view to your enter into eternal dwellings. You want to look at what that looks like? Look at the next parable, verse 19. Here is a man who has identity only in terms of his wealth. He's called a rich man. Here is Lazarus who has a name but nothing else. We don't know how the rich man got rich, but we know that he made no investment in Lazarus. And when Lazarus goes to Abraham's bosom and the rich man goes to Hades, the rich man had made no investment in Lazarus. That's what it looks like. That you'll make no investment of your wealth in that which is eternal, which is people. Your car won't go into eternity, your portfolio won't go into eternity, but you will, and your spouse will, and your children will, and the children in your Sunday school will, and people throughout Africa will. So I put it to you that I reckon half the people in any congregation are living consistently with the impossible application of the passage. As we're not remotely interested in making investments in the lives of people, financial investment in the lives of people. That's right. Half. Flip back, keep your finger there and go back to Matthew chapter 6. Here's one of the unheeded Christ sayings. Jesus is talking about doing your religion before people. And in verse 24, it's an interesting verse because it starts with a negative and ends with a negative. No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You can't serve God and money. So you can't serve God and money. You can't serve God and money. You must serve God and use money, or you will serve money and use God. You cannot serve both God and money. Impossible application. I am the exception. I can. I can serve God and I can serve money. Thank you very much. Now leave me alone. And that is precisely what the vast majority of people in your congregation think. Go back to, let's get into sex. Matthew chapter 5 verse 27, you have heard that it was said, don't commit adultery. I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. Therefore get your right eye and your right hand under control. Necessary application of the passage, get your body under control, because it's no good being fully bodied and being delivered into hell. This is a serious issue. Get your body under control. Recognise that adultery in the mind is adultery and stop it by getting your body under control. Impossible application of the passage, indulge in adultery as often as you please. It's the very opposite. Flee sexual immorality, run to sexual immorality. Flee from it, run to it. Half the congregation. When was the last time you thought about what your youth group does on a Saturday night? The majority of youth groups in Sydney go off and ogle at the cinema. It's dreadful, isn't it? A friend of mine in London has a person come round on a Saturday night to watch DVDs with him. The DVDs are chosen very carefully, but when the friend comes, they have supper together, and the friend always brings from the kitchen a tea towel. And my friend sometimes, when the DVD's being played, says, "Oh, it's tea towel time, brother," and the tea towel is placed over the screen. That's good, isn't it? Okay, rightio, you can take it down now, brother. There are things that I don't need to see, that are not helpful for me to see, and therefore the application of the tea towel is vitally important. Get control. Get control. All right, so necessary, impossible. What is the possible application? How may it work out in practice? Let's go back to Luke chapter 15. How does this work out in practice? How can I use worldly wealth to gain friends for myself so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings? When my father was converted, he was immediately discipled by a fellow businessman who told my father 4 things. Remember, this is in the early 1960s. He said, Cookie, there are 4 things that a Christian does. And he went through, and the 4th one is you tithe everything that comes, every amount of income that comes, 1 in 10. And when I became a Christian and went to theological college and became enlightened, I said to my father, you know, you don't have to tithe, we're not under law anymore. And my father said, when you give more under grace than I do under law, you come and tell me then. And he was quite right, because I had used grace as a cover for greed. 1 in 10. If 1 in 7 is a good guide, 1 in 10 is a good guide for giving. If 1 in 7 is a good guide for rest, 1 in 10 is a good guide for giving. You can give more, or you can give less. I'm not being legalistic. But how much do you generally give? What do you think about that? 1 in 10, a bloke said, oh, you shouldn't say 1 in 10 because that it creates the impression that the 90 is for me. I said, okay, what do you say then? Oh, the 90 is for me. 1 in 10 is a good starting point. Go to 20 if you like. 20% if you like. So these are possible applications of the passage. How do you get control of this? All right. So last year in our denomination, Presbyterian Church of Australia, 3 senior ministers had to resign because of adultery. And so I got a senior minister from a Scottish background to come and speak to our final year male students. And he said that in the middle of winter in Australia, when he goes down for his shower on a Wednesday morning, in the middle of winter, it's cold, he turns the cold tap on only, and his body recoils, and he says, get in there, body, you're not in control, Jesus is. Particularly Dara, he is Scottish, okay? But he tells his body, he says, when I'm swimming my laps and I'm exhausted, my body's not in control, I say to my body, you swim another lap. Get your body under control. And the same principle applies for this. Get your wallet under control. When was the last time you gave your wallet a really good lesson that Jesus is Lord? You think about your bank account. Think about the amount you've got in your bank account. Don't call it out. Think about it. Take half of it and give it away to evangelistic enterprise that invests in the spiritual health of people. How long will it take you to recover your balance when you've given half away? 6 weeks. That's what it'll take me. 6 weeks. And I've taught my wealth a lesson. There's going to be a lot of benefit to a lot of people if we all did it. And I've taught my wealth a lesson. You will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Gain friends for yourselves. Doesn't Jesus understand justification by faith? How can I be more welcome than I'm going to be clothed with the perfect righteousness of Christ? Jesus understands very well justification by faith, but he also knows that there is a day of accounting in which God will rebuke and God will reward his people. So I need to hold those 2 things to be true. And one of the areas, according to Jesus, that's going to be examined, if you look at verses 10 to 12, is how I handle wealth. In fact, when I looked at 10 to 12, I thought, when I'm on ordination boards in future, that is an area I should be asking people. Tell me about the way you handle your budget, because your use of wealth is indicative of your ability to handle true riches. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm working at 3 levels: necessary, impossible, possible, all right? And particularly in the area of wealth, this is going to be a sensitive issue. Am I going to declare certain things? If you're not tithing, you can't be a believer. No, I'm not going to be saying that. But I am going to be suggesting that 1 in 10 might be a good guide for you. But I'm not going to be legalistic about that. In other words, I'm not going to push the possible up to the level of the necessary. The necessary is what you must do. The possible is what you may do. Okay, any questions about that? Anything? Okay, lastly then, the other area I think, and that anticipates the question of that our preaching is very rarely earthed, that is lack of application. The last criticism of expository preaching is that our preaching is dull. Now, how do you overcome that? You overcome that, I think, by being an omnivorous person whose interests are omnivorous, and you keep recording things which happen. You keep reading the newspaper. You keep looking around to things that are happening all day. Now, are you in that mindset? Have you recorded anything that has been said today? Did you record the quote of James Denny? The church is at its healthiest when its theologians are its evangelists and its evangelists are its theologians. I put it to you, you should be recording that. You don't know how you're going to use that. But if that's not recorded, it's gone. And you won't have access to it. And so at home in London, I've got a black book which I record everything into that black book of what's happening at the moment. I just read here on the way here on the train from Preston, I was reading, what was I reading? I think I was reading a magazine in which Chesterton says the best soldier is not driven by hatred for what's in front of him, but by love for what's behind him. Now, I don't know when I'm going to use that, but it's helpful to record that. And anything that is there for recording is good to record because it is potentially illustrative. And things are happening all the time. Now, I always had students say, oh, but nothing ever happens to me, so make something happen to you. Get out there and make something happen to you. Oh, I'm not a good storyteller. Become a good storyteller, please, for the sake of your congregation. You need to be engaging and you need to use stories, and you never know when a story is going to come up. Dame Cicely Saunders, who was the founder of the hospice movement, in her obituary in the London Daily Telegraph said this: Dame Cicely used to say that the dying have three needs. 1, stay with me. 2, talk to me. 3, hold me. Now, Spurgeon said that pastors should be much at the deathbeds of our people. Stay with me, hold me, talk to me. Now, I think it's excellent advice, isn't it? I need to note that down, and it'll just pass me by unless I note things like that. So I'm sitting at a breakfast bar in South Africa. I've got the bishop's daughter, who is 19 years of age, sitting here, and I've got my son, who is 19 years of age, sitting here. And the bishop's daughter says, "Oh, my father is a wonderful man." I said, "Why do you think your father is a wonderful man?" "Oh, he is such a wonderful preacher. He is such a wise counsellor, and he is so good looking." I turned to my son, and he looks at me and said, "You're a loser, Dad." I write it down because it's just gone otherwise. How are you going to use something like that? The other day I was preaching on Obadiah. Which is all about pride. I have this against you, the pride of your heart has deceived you. And I used that story. In Australia, we show affection by putting one another down. We're professional at it. If an Australian ever puts you down and calls you a loser, you know that you're greatly loved, right? And you would think, therefore, in a society, in a culture where you're constantly being put down, pride would never be a problem. I'm telling you, pride will be a problem. It just goes underground, it camouflages itself, it goes deeper into the psyche. Putting people down doesn't solve the problem of pride. Martin Luther said, "My biggest enemy is not Pope or Cardinal, it is pride." What do you think is the answer to pride? Here in Obadiah, God tells us what his response to pride is. So that's a way of doing it. Notice, I've told you something about me. I've told you that I've got a son who greatly respects me. I've told you that I've got a son. I've told you something about the way South African daughters are. And I think it's just very helpful. Now, you've just got to keep looking at these things and keep accumulating all the time. That's terribly important, I think. That's illustration. All right, I've had about enough of this. I've been talking. Do you want to give some relief to me by asking a question or making a comment? Yes.
I was going to ask you about when you've got preaching on Sunday, how does your week look? What kind of time do you spend preparing?
Yeah, so when I'm going Sunday, what I like to do is I don't have Mondays off because I'm the sort of person who likes to get everything done before I have a day off. So I have Saturdays off, so you've got to do what works for you. And therefore, if I knew that the sermon is, I couldn't rest on a Monday if I knew I had a sermon to prepare. So on the Monday, I try and fulfill most of my pyramid. I try and get my summary, my movements, an idea of the dominant picture. I try and have that page full of material. And then I can move out and talk to people about it and look for illustrations as well. If I know that basically this is the big question I'm answering, then I'm on to that by thinking around that as I look at all things that are happening this week. On Tuesday, I'll look at that and I'll start to structure introduction, conclusion, and a number of points in the structure. Now, the number of points in my structure generally will coincide with the number of movements in the passage. Wednesday, I'll think about it again. Thursday, I'll start looking at my commentaries. And I'll start, by now I'll know the big questions I need answered. If there are some things there that I'm not seeing, or there are corrections at all, I'll have a look for those. And by Thursday afternoon, I sit down with a piece of paper, generally a really nice piece of paper. There's a stationer in London called RYMAN. Do you know them? Well, they're in England anyway. And they sell really nice paper. No, I've got it in the other bag. And I get a fountain pen and I write. I'm ready to write my sermon. And I just fill in the details and I write it. And I write it longhand. So the sermon which I preached today, I'll show you what it looked like. There it is. It looks like that. All right, nice paper, fountain pen, and I'll highlight things. So that's how I write it. Now, I get it into my head by writing it out. Once I've used that, I generally don't use a manuscript more than twice. So I'll rewrite it again. And I'll write it with the audience in mind. Okay, anything else? Thanks for the question.
So how many hours exactly? When are you asking?
Were you asking how many hours it takes? Well, Lloyd Jones says the older you get, the longer it takes to prepare a sermon in his experience. Now, that's not my experience. I reckon that it would take me 20 hours to prepare a sermon from go to woe, and you divide that up through the week.
Practically, have you got a way that you archive those illustrations and applications for your black book?
No, I get my black book and I generally write them down under, and the black book is divided alphabetically. And so I put it down like Dame Cicely Saunders' death, D. And I put it down under the subject that I think I'm most going to look at. And I just keep flipping through my book. So the book I've got for this trip, I've got a number of quotes in there. I've got a quote from Ray Steadman, where people from a congregation said, "We just got rid of our pastor." Why? Because he was always telling us we were going to hell. Doesn't your new pastor tell you going to hell? Oh yes, he tells us we're going to hell, but he tells us as though he's got a broken heart about it and he's not enjoying the prospect. So I write that down. And I just saw that in a sermon I was reading, actually. So you just write it down. Because the bloke's quoting someone else, so you can quote someone else. Yeah. So what was your question again? I'm sorry.
No, that's, you know, like, I guess some folks try and have a folder where the Bible, books of the Bible, and have
Yeah.
kind of advanced applications and illustrations. So they turn.
Yeah, you've got to do what works for you. I've just got a number of black books. But Lloyd Jones in Preachers and Preachers says he thinks it's crash professionalism collecting all those illustrations. But I don't know how he used to do it. Because almost every sermon he had was full of, you know, there are 5 things that I've noticed, and they're full of interesting analogies and illustrations, but I don't know how he did it. So mere mortals, I think, have got to record them somewhere, otherwise we forget them. Okay.
Can I ask you a question about length of sermon?
Yeah.
Depend on text? Half an hour?
No, I think half an hour is far too long. I don't know why we need to go more than 20 minutes. I've been preaching for 20 minutes in London, and I think people are just so pleased. Nobody comes up and says, "Oh, that was far too short, oh, we're shortchanged." I think if you're at a convention, you can go for 30 to 35 minutes. But I can't see why we have to go on and on and on. I say that because I think we preach far too long. I don't know about Scotland. I haven't heard Scottish preachers. But certainly they're too long in England.
Do you like, when you're preaching, do you sort of have titles sort of it, and then you sort of expound upon them like a
Sorry, what? How do I?
Yeah, when you've got your sermon, you have sort of little springboards that you sort of, oh yeah, then I'll sort of.
Yeah, yeah. So you know basically what this section is, and you can get off your notes. I think if you can try and get off your notes, that's important. Yeah. Yes.
Have you got any practical advice to stop your possible applications overtaking necessary?
Yeah, well, just be careful that you know that you're in the area of possible and may rather than must. I just think you've got to be careful of that, but you often miss that out. I heard a preacher in the United States who I quoted the other day before I realised that he's still around and alive. But he preached a sermon on the question, is it possible to own a new BMW and be a Christian? And came to the conclusion that it is not possible to own a new BMW and be a Christian.
Sorry, in terms of emphasis, in terms of if you've got a message, how do you stop your main point becoming from a possible application to make sure it's rooted?
Well, this is what I'm saying, that I would think that a possible application of the text on wealth is to think about whether it's possible for you to own a new BMW and be a God-honouring Christian. And this man pushes the possible application into the necessary by saying you cannot own a new BMW and be a God-honouring Christian. It's an example of the possible becoming necessary. And I think it's ultimate foolishness, because I'm a Christian because of the gospel pointing me to Christ. I'm not a Christian because of the gospel pointing me to Christ and me not owning a BMW. And I think we've got to be careful about that. It's like the young preacher who might say, if you're not interested in Christian biography, then you're not a Christian. If you're not interested in Christian biography, well, there's a whole wealth out there. Why don't you get interested in biography? I think it's a better way of saying the possible without pushing it into the necessary. We push the possible into the necessary by making absolute statements. I'm not against making absolute statements if the text gives you the right to make absolute statements. There is only one way to God, and that is through Jesus. Full stop, absolute statement. You must come to God through Jesus, or you're following an idol. All right? Now, but be very careful, therefore, of taking possible and pushing that into the area of necessary. And the possible is an implication of the text without being at the heart of the text. Yep.
Did you say that you include your impossible ones?
Oh, I include my impossible because I reckon the majority of my listeners are living consistently with the impossible. And I tell you how I discovered that. I was going to a Presbyterian church for 15 years. 3 elderly ladies sat behind me, and every day at the end of the sermon, at the end of the service, I'd turn around to Betty, Joyce and Robin, and I'd say, what do you think he was talking about today? And they often heard the preacher say precisely the opposite of what I heard him say. Now, either I was wrong or they were wrong, but I reckon my hearing was right. You know, it's by grace you've been saved through faith. It's not of yourself, it's the gift of God. It comes by grace through faith, not of good works. Oh yes, what he's actually saying is I've got to be good. That's not what he's saying at all. But I usually I reinterpret and hear the impossible application.
Does that a little bit anticipate how you could be misinterpreted and you're heading it off at the pass by saying what I'm not saying?
Yeah, that's right, what I'm not saying, and you don't even have to say that. But think, what is the impossible and how can I introduce this? Okay, thanks everybody.